December 20th, 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes. Snow had covered the broken branches and shell craters until the forest looked almost clean again, as if war had been wrapped in white cloth for burial. The trees stood black and wet beneath the frost. A ruined American position smoked faintly in the morning cold. Torn cardboard, ration tins, spent casings, and boot prints hardened into ice lay scattered between roots and frozen mud. In that pale silence, one of the smallest objects on the battlefield looked almost absurd. A thin packet yellowed at the edges, stamped in English, light enough to be mistaken for trash, bright enough to catch the eye of a hungry man. Inside it was a handful of sour crystals, lemon powder, not gold, not ammunition, not morphine, just a sharp yellow dust carried across an ocean by an army that had learned something the German soldier was only beginning to understand. Wars were not won only by guns and courage. They were also won by calories, vitamins, chemistry, and the industrial miracle of making health portable. To the men who found such packets in abandoned foxholes, wrecked vehicles, or captured supply dumps, America already seemed wasteful beyond reason. Even before they understood the powder, they understood the packaging. The paper was clean, the print was clear. The contents had been measured by strangers in factories thousands of miles away, sealed, shipped, stacked, unloaded, driven forward, and delivered to a man freezing in a forest. That alone was a revelation. The object itself was tiny, but the system behind it was immense. The U.S. Army's quartermaster research effort had begun before the war, and by the Second World War, it had produced an astonishing range of specialized rations. Between 1941 and 1945, roughly 1 billion special rations were procured at a cost of about $675 million, built on the stated premise that American troops, especially troops in combat, should receive the best food available in the most appetizing form reasonably possible. The first million K rations were ordered in May 1942, and by 1944, production peaked at more than 105 million. That mattered because by the winter of 1944, the German soldier no longer experienced war as a parade of conquest. He experienced it as subtraction. Less fuel, less rest, less certainty, less time, less margin for error. What he had expected from this war, and what many had been taught to expect from Americans, now collided with frozen reality. Propaganda had taught him that the enemy from across the Atlantic was soft, commercial, spoiled by comfort, a civilization of abundance too weak to suffer. America, in that telling, was rich but decadent, a nation of mechanics and clerks, not warriors. German military culture, proud of hardness, believed deprivation itself could become virtue. Hunger meant discipline. Simplicity meant strength. Endurance meant superiority. If American soldiers carried chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, chewing gum, candy bars, cheese, and fruit powders, then surely they must be cushioned men, dependent on little luxuries. Surely hardship would strip them down and expose their weakness. But in forests, beaches, hedgerows, islands, deserts, and ruined towns, the opposite happened. The comforts were not symptoms of softness. They were instruments. American food science did not exist to pamper the soldier. It existed to preserve him. The K ration had been designed as an individual assault ration, easy to carry and packed with surprising variety for its size. The dinner unit alone might contain a canned cheese product, biscuits, a candy bar, gum, sugar, cigarettes, matches, and beverage powder. The breakfast and supper units added meat, cereal bars, coffee, bouillon, fruit bars, and more. The ration was not perfect, and the soldiers often complained bitterly about it, but its very existence revealed something profound. Behind each rifleman stood laboratories, dietitians, chemists, packing engineers, agricultural planners, railroad workers, truck drivers, can manufacturers, and an entire continental economy committed to keeping him alive. And among those strange little provisions was the sour yellow packet. The lemon powder itself was not beloved by Americans. Far from it. In the K rations dinner unit, the packet usually contained 7 grams of synthetic lemon crystals. It could be mixed with cold water, which made it practical in the field, and it was kept because it supplied what the ration desperately needed to provide, about 60 milligrams of ascorbic acid, enough to meet a daily vitamin C requirement. Men in combat often despised the taste. Many called it battery acid. Soldiers discovered that when mixed with chlorinated purified water, it could taste even worse. And if added too quickly after purification tablets, it could interfere with the treatment of the water itself. By 1945, the Army removed lemon powder from the K ration and replaced it with orange, grape, or coffee alternatives. Yet its purpose had been serious, scientific, and deeply modern. It was an unpleasant little ration with a life-preserving intention. That contradiction made it unforgettable. The German soldier who slid open such a packet did not encounter sweetness first. He encountered modern war in miniature. He expected a luxury and found chemistry. He expected indulgence and found planning. He expected a trivial American excess and discovered a sour answer to a medical problem as old as armies themselves: how to keep men from breaking down when fresh food could not follow them. Vitamin C deficiency was no romantic battlefield death. It was weakness, swelling, bleeding, fatigue, pain, and gradual collapse. The old curse of long campaigns and poor provisioning had haunted armies for centuries. By World War II, the United States treated nutrition not as an afterthought, but as national defense. In 1940, the Food and Nutrition Board was established to advise on defense nutrition, and in 1943, it published the first recommended daily dietary allowances, explicitly including ascorbic acid, vitamin C, among the nutrients essential to health. So the packet on the snow was more than flavoring. It was evidence of a political economy. In authoritarian imagination, power often wore the face of steel, discipline, and command. In democratic practice, power also wore the face of logistics, standardization, nutrition tables, sanitation, farm output, and medical foresight. The lemon powder tasted harsh because it had not been made to flatter the senses. It had been made to do a job. There is something almost perfect in that symbolism. It was bright, sharp, ordinary, and unheroic. It asked for clean water. It dissolved into something useful. It represented a civilization wealthy enough to invest heavily in the life of the individual private, yet practical enough to pack his survival into paper. American soldiers themselves were rarely sentimental about it. Cartoonist Bill Mauldin, the great poet of mud, fatigue, and infantry cynicism, mocked the stuff as a mixture of carbolic acid and ersatz lemon powder, and added the unforgettable challenge: try drinking that in a muddy foxhole in freezing weather. That complaint matters because it makes the object more believable. The lemon powder was not mythologized in the moment. It was ridiculed, cursed, traded away, or tossed aside. Yet that is often how history hides its most consequential tools. Not in glory, but in annoyance. Not in admiration, but in routine. The packet was hated precisely because it was real. Imagine then the emotional contrast. A German infantryman, cold, underfed, and exhausted, opens an American ration expecting a childish sweetness from a nation he has been taught to despise. Instead, he finds a product of relentless calculation, a powder to protect against deficiency, a packet meant to be mixed with purified water, a distasteful substance included because health mattered more than pleasure. The discovery unsettles him because it does not fit the old story. America in this form is not decadent. It is disciplined in a different language. The German army had celebrated hardness as moral truth. America had industrialized care. One side worshipped sacrifice and called it destiny. The other side put vitamin C in a packet and sent it into the snow. It is easy, from a distance, to make too much of a single ration item. Lemon powder did not win the war by itself. It did not halt panzers, break bunkers, or fly bombers. Yet in war, little things accumulate into survival. A handful of crystals in one packet is nothing. Millions of packets across multiple fronts become a shield against quiet attrition. The American effort to prevent vitamin deficiency was so broad that it touched not just rations but the civilian home front and an entire agricultural transformation. Fresh fruits spoiled too easily for global war. The military therefore pushed for processed citrus on a vast scale. Florida growers expanded by an additional 100,000 acres during the 1940s to meet wartime demand for canned citrus products. The concern was explicit. Scurvy and vitamin deficiency could not be allowed to undermine troops fighting overseas. That effort produced strange scenes full of historical irony. While German soldiers at the front encountered American citrus powders and rations, German prisoners of war in the United States would later help build parts of the wartime citrus infrastructure itself. In Florida, around 10,000 German POWs were put to work helping construct a massive 65-acre processing plant for Citrus World in Lake Wales. The same war that sent yellow powder across battlefields also drew captured Germans into the vast machinery of American food production. The enemy, who once saw U.S. rations as evidence of decadence, now labored inside the abundance that made them possible. There was something almost unbearable in that reversal. The German soldier who had marched east or west, believing history belonged to force encountered by war's end, a civilization whose strength was not merely in firepower, but in systems that turned farms into medicine, factories into nourishment, and shipping lanes into invisible lifelines. Even the sourness told a story. Lemon powder did not resemble celebration. It resembled responsibility. It was part of a nation preparing not just to fight, but to sustain the fighters. In this sense, the packet became a recurring symbol of American abundance, not because it was luxurious, but because abundance in a mature industrial democracy does not always look like luxury. Sometimes it looks like excess sugar and candy in a ration box. Sometimes it looks like a chocolate bar. Sometimes it looks like a fresh orange juice plant rising from wartime demand. And sometimes it looks like a crude little envelope of synthetic crystals included in spite of complaints because some staff officer, laboratory scientist, or nutrition planner refused to let the anonymous man at the front become a casualty of preventable deficiency. Democracy, for all its noise and contradiction, had done something deeply radical. It had treated the body of the ordinary soldier as worth planning for. There is a reason such details struck enemy observers so forcefully. Captured American supply dumps seemed inexhaustible. Even the packaging carried psychological weight. German troops often saw in American provisions an unnerving material confidence. Cigarettes by the carton, gum by the packet, candy as routine, coffee so valued that U.S. soldiers demanded more of it, and beverage powders in multiple flavors. American soldiers themselves were so attached to coffee that observers in September 1944 reported every officer and enlisted man interviewed wanted more coffee units in the K ration. Some men prized the breakfast unit so highly that they would leave dinner or supper untouched while reaching for the breakfast ration of the dead. This was not triviality. It was morale as supply doctrine. What German soldiers expected then was an enemy softened by abundance. What they experienced was an enemy fortified by it. That is the true emotional hinge of the story. The German imagination had confused deprivation with virtue and comfort with weakness, yet men do not become stronger because they are underfed. They become weaker, slower, more error-prone, more vulnerable to disease, and more likely to collapse at the edge of endurance. Starvation can produce fanaticism for a while. It cannot create sustainable military power. The American system, however imperfect, understood that health itself was combat power. The lemon packet in the snow was a tiny footnote to that truth. This is where the story grows larger than one battlefield. During World War II, the United States was not merely feeding troops. It was reimagining nutrition as strategy. The Food Distribution Administration, created in 1942, controlled procurement, storage, and distribution of food to the military allies and civilians. The nation's first recommended dietary allowances included vitamin C as a required daily intake. Wartime posters warned that millions of Americans were not getting the vitamins they needed. The Basic 7 nutrition system singled out oranges, grapefruit, and tomatoes as a distinct group essential to strength. It was a culture mobilizing the science of nourishment. That helps explain why a German soldier might misread the object completely. He saw powder. The American system saw prevention. He saw flavoring. The American system saw a hedge against debility. He saw surplus. The American state saw readiness. He saw the childish yellow promise of lemonade. Behind it stood laboratories founded in 1936, procurement contracts worth hundreds of millions, and a ration program designed to compress calories, sanitation, and nutrition into the smallest possible space for combat troops. And because this was war, the discovery often happened at moments of heightened desperation. A ration is read differently by a full man than by a starving one. In winter battle, taste becomes secondary to utility. A packet that might seem laughable in peacetime becomes precious when the body is failing. Imagine cracked lips, inflamed gums, fatigue under wool stiff with frost, the metallic stink of cordite frozen into cloth. Imagine hands too numb for fine work trying to open a paper packet in the wind. Imagine the sudden sting of citrus on the tongue. It is not pleasure. It is shock. It is the body remembering something green and living in a world of mud, smoke, and iron. This is where the fictional and the historical meet. Not an invention against fact array, but in the emotional truth that records cannot fully capture. A report can tell us the packet held 7 grams and roughly 60 milligrams of vitamin C. A regulation can tell us why it was issued. A memoir can tell us men hated it. But only imagination can bridge the last inch and show what it meant for an enemy soldier, standing amid the debris of a collapsing war, to realize that even the most irritating item in an American ration had been placed there deliberately, intelligently, with his opponent's future health in mind. And that realization could be shattering. Not because lemon powder was miraculous, but because it hinted that the war was being fought on levels German ideology had failed to master. Total war is won not simply by producing tanks, but by integrating agriculture, medicine, chemistry, industry, transportation, and administrative foresight. It is won by ensuring the private in the field remains fit enough to march, think, heal, and survive. German planning had often sought brilliance, speed, and force. American planning at scale added continuity. It had depth. There would be another packet, another truck, another warehouse, another rail car, another processing plant, another convoy crossing the Atlantic. The yellow packet thus became a kind of prophecy, not because German soldiers believed in lemon powder, but because they began to see what it represented. The battlefield was full of symbols if a man knew how to read them. An abandoned Sherman, dry socks in quantity, canned meat from Chicago, coffee from home, gum in a cardboard sleeve, chocolate wrapped and stamped, water purification tablets, fruit powder, clean bandages, sulfa, spare gloves. The meaning of all of it was the same. The enemy possessed not merely courage, but replenishment, not merely weapons, but renewal. If the first transformation was military, the second was ideological. Many Germans who later entered captivity in the United States underwent a quieter shock than the one delivered by artillery. The United States held more than 425,000 prisoners of war during the conflict, mostly Germans, alongside tens of thousands of Italians and thousands of Japanese. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs in America were fed well, clothed, given toiletries, and had access to the same medical and dental treatment as U.S. troops. Many were leased out to address labor shortages, especially in agriculture and food processing. This was not paradise, and captivity remained captivity. But to men raised in a regime built on hierarchy, scarcity, and coercion, the experience of being fed decently by the enemy carried enormous psychological force. At places like Papago Park and hundreds of other camps, German prisoners encountered not only American power, but American routine. There were more than 500 POW camps in the United States, holding over 400,000 prisoners, most of them German. Camp administrators understood that discipline, activity, and good meals mattered. In Arizona alone, German POW labor was used in cotton fields, and thousands were projected for harvest work. The pattern repeated nationwide. The enemy soldier became labor inside the enemy economy, and the economy did not collapse under the strain. It expanded. Here the lemon powder acquires another meaning. On the front, it symbolized the American ability to preserve life at a distance. In captivity, it symbolized something more unsettling still, the abundance of a society rich enough to extend decent treatment even to defeated enemies. The packet's bitterness becomes symbolic. Freedom is not always sweet in wartime. Democracy is not gentle by nature. It drafts, rations, taxes, censors, wounds, and kills. Yet at its strongest, it refuses to reduce every human body to expendable matter. It organizes food, medicine, and procedure around the assumption that the individual, however ordinary, has value. Even the prisoner has rights. Even the private deserves vitamins. That is not sentimentality. It is a practical moral structure. The same nation that could bomb cities also built nutritional standards. The same army that stormed beaches also worried about ascorbic acid. This duality is easy to mock until one sees its military consequence. In official U.S. wartime medical history, severe vitamin deficiency, florid avidominosis, was considered extremely rare in American forces, except under conditions of capture and imprisonment. That statement alone tells us how effectively nourishment had been integrated into the wider machinery of war. The contrast becomes sharper when set beside the treatment of Allied prisoners under German control. U.S. Army medical history later recorded that ordinary German-issued rations to American and British POWs were gravely inadequate, averaging around 850 calories per day as issued and closer to 650 calories as actually consumed, grossly below what was required to maintain health or life. The same source noted that such deficiencies stood in stark contrast to the broader nutritional condition of German troops and civilians, and to U.S. military nutrition practices. This is not a simple story of one side starving and the other feasting. It is a story of systems. One system tolerated or imposed life-threatening nutritional neglect under captivity. The other, despite all wartime harshness, institutionalized feeding as obligation. Now return to the battlefield and the packet in the snow. Its symbolism deepens. A German soldier might first laugh at the notion that a war could contain lemon powder at all. Then he might taste it and hate it. Then he might learn what it was for. Then, perhaps months later in captivity, he might see oranges unloaded by the crate, juice processed by the acre, bread enriched by regulation, and medical examinations treated as routine. And slowly the bitter taste changes meaning. What once looked ridiculous becomes explanatory. The packet had not been an oddity. It had been a clue. It is tempting to think transformations of ideology happen in great speeches or catastrophic defeats. Often they happen in smaller encounters. A pair of clean boots, a field kitchen, a chocolate bar in abundance, a dentist in a POW camp, a ration label listing contents with bureaucratic confidence, a camp meal better than what some had expected from the enemy, or a lemon powder packet whose very unpleasantness proves it was designed for function, not vanity. That is how belief erodes in real life. Not all at once, but item by item, contradiction by contradiction, until the official myth can no longer absorb the evidence before the eyes. For the German soldier, the emotional violence of this realization lay in humiliation, not merely defeat by force, but defeat by competence. Not simply outshot, but outsupplied, outfed, outorganized, outhealed, outproduced, and finally outlasted. The old heroic image of war allowed a man to imagine dying nobly against superior numbers. It was harder to imagine losing to packaging, nutrition tables, and citrus procurement. Yet that was part of what happened. Industrial democracies are often misunderstood because their strength appears ordinary. It wears paper labels instead of banners. And still, one must preserve the tragedy in the frame. The packet did not save everyone. Many men on both sides died of wounds, cold, infection, starvation, or the brutal arithmetic of campaigns already lost. America's abundance was never evenly distributed, never morally pure, never untouched by waste or contradiction. The K-ration itself became unpopular when used too long. Soldiers complained, traded components, and suffered monotony. Lemon powder was mocked. Coffee shortages irritated men. The existence of planning did not erase hardship, but the difference between imperfect care and deliberate neglect can mean the difference between a weakened army and a functioning one, between recovery and collapse, between a wounded man healing or slipping away. So when we say the lemon powder could save lives, we must say it carefully. Glory through hardness, triumph through submission, greatness through domination. America sent many different messages, often contradictory, but in its ration system, there was one message unmistakable enough to survive even mockery. The ordinary man mattered enough to be maintained, not because he was noble, not because he was pure, because he was needed, and because in a democratic war machine, the citizen in uniform remained, however imperfectly, a citizen still. That is why the object lingers in memory more than its size deserves. There are weapons that change history by destroying bodies. There are also trivial objects that change understanding by revealing how a civilization thinks about bodies in the first place. The packet in the snow was such an object. A German soldier expected sweetness and found utility. He expected softness and found science. He expected waste and found a system. He expected proof of American weakness and found proof of American depth. In the long shadows after the fighting, that realization did not remain confined to one battlefield. It followed prisoners into camps. It followed laborers into citrus plants. It followed veterans back into peacetime breakfast tables, where wartime experiments with orange juice and preservation reshaped American habits for generations. The wartime drive to nourish troops helped transform citrus into a staple of civilian life. The battlefield packet belonged to a larger story in which military necessity and agricultural expansion merged, and the legacy of that merger would outlive the war itself. So the final image is not of triumphal music or a general speech. It is quieter than that. Snow over torn earth. A ration packet opened by numb fingers, a sour taste in a dry mouth. A man realizing, perhaps without wanting to, that the enemy had learned how to preserve strength in all the small, unglamorous ways that ideology had taught him to ignore. In that moment, the war becomes legible through a minor object. Not by romance, but by evidence. And the larger truth is this: freedom, when it survives long enough to build institutions, often expresses itself not only in elections or speeches, but in the mundane architecture of care, in the conviction that supply should reach the private, that food should be studied, that deficiencies should be prevented, that prisoners should be fed, that farms, factories, laboratories, and transport networks are not background noise to history, but part of its moral structure. Abundance is never innocent. Yet when joined to responsibility, it can become something stronger than spectacle. The lemon powder was bitter. Men mocked it, cursed it, and sometimes used it for anything but drinking. Yet in its bitterness lay a strange kind of mercy. It was not meant to delight. It was meant to preserve. It was truthfully, not as a miracle cure, not as folklore. It saved life in the quiet, statistical way that modern logistics often do. It represented a method of preventing deficiency before it became disease. It turned water into a vitamin-bearing drink. It reduced one more vulnerability in a soldier already surrounded by danger, scaled across millions of meals and months of campaigning. Such prevention matters. A war is not sustained only by dramatic rescues. It is sustained by the daily avoidance of avoidable collapse. The recurring image returns again, yellow crystals dissolving in a dented cup, a little cloud of brightness and gray water. Not beautiful exactly, not elegant, but visible. The crystals vanish, and in vanishing, they do their work. That too is symbolic. Democracies often fight in this way. Their strength disperses through systems rather than concentrating only in spectacle. It dissolves into roads, warehouses, calories, field medicine, spare parts, dental care, rail timetables, school, lunch policy, vitamin standards, agricultural acreage, and the stubborn insistence that logistics is not glamorous but decisive. By war's end, when prisoners worked under American guard in fields, packing houses, and camps, some were seeing more than comfort. They were seeing the social base of military endurance. The farms were productive. The processing plants were immense. The bureaucracy functioned. The enemy state had enough confidence to feed captives well and extract labor without reducing every prisoner to starvation. The United States, for all its inequalities and flaws, possessed a deep reservoir of material security, bound to a civic language of rights and standards. It is not difficult to understand why some German prisoners later carried home impressions that complicated everything they had once been told. And perhaps that is where the lemon packet becomes almost poetic. A lemon is not a grand imperial symbol. It is not an eagle, not a flag, not a marching song. It is tart, ordinary, bright, and alive with a kind of humble force. In powdered form, it becomes even less impressive, a reduced thing, dried and measured, stripped of fragrance and beauty. Yet even then, it retains its purpose. It is life condensed. Sunlight translated into chemistry. Agriculture made portable. Civil society made field expedient. A republic at war cannot always give its soldiers orchards. Sometimes all it can send is powder. But even powder can carry a philosophy. The German regime had promised democracy in one of its least dramatic forms. Inconvenient, standardized, a little ugly, sometimes resented, but designed so that more men would live than die from what could be prevented. And so, in the frozen hush of the Ardennes, and in the long echo of camps and processing plants beyond the front, that yellow dust came to mean more than flavor. It became a symbol of a nation whose strength could be poured into a cup, dissolved in water, and carried by any anonymous soldier into the worst places on earth. It tasted sour. It looked small. But hidden inside it was one of the deepest lessons of the war. Empires worship hardness, but free societies endure by learning how to keep human beings alive.